A distant gunshot echoed across the Montana plains as Grace Finley clutched her 3-month-old daughter tighter to her chest, watching through tear-blurred eyes as the wagon train disappeared over the horizon without her. The year was 1876, and at 22 years of age, she had just been abandoned in the wilderness with nothing but a small bundle of supplies, her baby, and the clothes on her back. "Hush now, Emma," Grace whispered, rocking the whimpering infant. "We'll be all right." But as the setting sun cast long shadows across the barren landscape, she wasn't sure she believed her own words. Thomas Harding, the wagon master, had made it clear when they left Independence that anyone who slowed the group would be left behind. Grace's husband had died 2 weeks ago from fever, and without a man to help pull her weight, the others had quickly grown resentful. When Emma's crying kept everyone awake for the 3rd night in a row, Thomas had made his decision. 3 days' rations and a canteen, he'd said gruffly, dropping the small bundle at her feet. "There's a settlement about 40 miles east. If you're lucky, someone might come along." Now, as night fell, Grace sat beneath a lone cottonwood tree, feeding Emma and fighting back tears. The baby's round face was the image of her father, and it both comforted and pained Grace to look at her. She had to survive for Emma's sake. They would reach that settlement somehow. Morning brought the relentless sun, and the realization that 40 miles was an impossible distance with a baby in her arms. Grace fashioned a sling from her shawl, rationed her water carefully, and began walking east, following the wagon tracks. By midday, her lips were cracked, and Emma was fussing from the heat. "Just a little further," Grace murmured, though she'd barely covered 5 miles. Her legs trembled with each step, and when she stumbled over a rock, sending her and Emma tumbling to the ground, the baby's wail pierced the still air. Grace checked her daughter frantically. Emma was unharmed but screaming with indignation. As Grace tried to soothe her, a sound made her freeze hoofbeats approaching fast. Fear gripped her heart. Indians, outlaws, either could mean death. She scrambled to her feet, looking for a place to hide, but the flat terrain offered no shelter. The rider crested the hill and Grace's breath caught. A lone cowboy atop a chestnut mare, silhouetted against the sky. He spotted her immediately and slowed his horse to a walk, approaching cautiously. "Madam," his voice carried across the distance. "You all right?" Grace clutched Emma tighter, uncertain whether to run or beg for help. The stranger dismounted about 20 feet away, keeping his hands visible. "Name's Wade Keller," he called. "I work the Rockingham Ranch about 15 miles east of here." He was tall and broad-shouldered, with sun-weathered skin and deep blue eyes that studied her with concern. His dark brown hair fell in waves beneath his hat, and a week's worth of stubble covered his jaw. He wasn't much older than Grace, perhaps 27 or 28. I'm Grace Finley," she stammered. "This is my daughter, Emma." "What in heaven's name are you doing out here alone, Mrs. Finley?" Wade asked, taking another step forward. The simple question broke the fragile control Grace had maintained. Tears spilled down her cheeks as she explained her situation in halting words. Wade's expression darkened with anger as she described being abandoned. "What kind of men would leave a mother and baby to die?" he muttered. Then, more gently, "You're both coming with me. The ranch has plenty of room, and Mrs. Miller, the owner's wife, she'll be glad for the company." Grace hesitated. "I don't want to be a burden." "Burden?" Wade shook his head. "Madam, out here, helping folks in need isn't charity, it's how we all survive." He approached his horse and adjusted the saddle. "Now, I'm going to lift you up if that's all right. It's a fair piece to the ranch and you look about ready to drop." Too exhausted to protest, Grace nodded. Wade carefully helped her mount, then swung up behind her. Emma, nestled in her sling, quieted at the gentle rocking motion as the horse began walking. "Been working for the Millers going on 5 years now," Wade said as they rode. "They're good people. Mr. Miller passed last winter, pneumonia took him. Mrs. Miller's running the place with me and a couple other hands." Grace leaned back slightly, unable to keep herself fully upright. Wade's solid presence behind her felt reassuring, his arm steady around her waist to keep her and Emma secure. "My husband, Daniel," Grace's voice caught. "He died 2 weeks ago. Fever." "I'm sorry to hear that," Wade said quietly. "Losing someone on the trail, it's a hard thing." They rode in silence for a while, the rhythmic hoofbeats and the vast emptiness around them creating a strange intimacy. Emma slept peacefully against Grace's chest. "What were you heading to?" Wade asked eventually. "Oregon. Daniel had a cousin there who offered him work in a lumber mill." Grace sighed. "Now I don't know where I'll go or what I'll do." "Well, first things first," Wade said. "Food, rest, and safety, then you can figure out the rest." The sun was beginning its descent when they arrived at the Rockingham. The ranch house was modest but well built, with a large barn and several outbuildings. A woman emerged from the house as they approached, tall and gray-haired, with a weathered face that brightened when she saw them. "Wade Keller, who have you brought home this time?" she called. Wade dismounted and helped Grace down carefully. "Mrs. Miller, this is Grace Finley and her daughter, Emma. They were abandoned by their wagon train. Mrs. Finley, this is Harriet Miller, the finest woman in Montana Territory." Mrs. Miller's expression softened as she took in Grace's exhausted state and the baby. "Oh, you poor dears. Come inside right away." The next few hours passed in a blur for Grace. A hot meal, a warm bath for her and Emma, clean clothes borrowed from Mrs. Miller's daughter who had married and moved to Helena. By nightfall, Grace found herself in a small but comfortable bedroom, Emma asleep in a makeshift cradle fashioned from a drawer lined with soft blankets. "You rest as long as you need," Mrs. Miller told her. "No one goes hungry on the Rockingham, and no one's without shelter, either." Grace fell asleep wondering if she had died on the trail, and this was heaven's welcome. The days that followed established a routine. Grace helped Mrs. Miller with household tasks while Emma napped or cooed in her cradle. The ranch hands Wade, an older man named Hank, and a young Mexican vaquero called Miguel came in for meals and spent their days tending cattle and maintaining the property. Wade, Grace noticed, always made a point to greet Emma, letting the baby grab his finger and babbling nonsense that made the little girl smile. His gentleness with her daughter stirred something in Grace's heart that she tried to ignore. Her husband had been dead barely a month. It wasn't proper to notice another man's kind eyes or the way his face transformed when he smiled. A week after their arrival, Grace found Wade on the porch after supper, whittling a small wooden horse. "Thank you," she said, sitting beside him. "For finding us, for bringing us here." Wade kept his eyes on his carving. "Anyone would have done the same." "No," Grace said firmly, "not anyone. Those people I traveled with for months, they left us to die." Wade's hands stilled. "I've been thinking about that. If you're agreeable, I'd like to ride to Fort Benton next week. The Army should know about a wagon master who abandons women and children. It's not right." The protective edge in his voice warmed Grace. "I would appreciate that." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the only sounds the soft scrape of Wade's knife against wood and the distant lowing of cattle. "What will you do?" Wade asked finally. "Once you've recovered your strength?" Grace had been pondering this question herself. "I'm not sure. I have no family, no money to speak of. I was thinking perhaps I could find work in a town somewhere cooking or cleaning." Wade frowned slightly. "It's hard for a woman alone with a child." "I know," Grace said softly, "but I'll manage somehow. I have to, for Emma's sake." Next morning, Mrs. Miller found Grace in the kitchen, kneading bread dough with Emma sleeping nearby. "I've been thinking," the older woman said, pouring herself coffee. "This house is too big for just me, and I could use the help year-round. Why don't you stay on, Grace? I can't pay much, but you'd have a home, food for you and Emma, and maybe a small wage besides." Grace's hands stilled in the dough. "Are you certain? You hardly know me," Mrs. Miller smiled. "I know enough. You're a hard worker, you're kind, and that baby deserves a stable home. Besides," she added with a twinkle in her eye, "Wade seems mighty taken with both of you." Grace felt her cheeks warm. "Mrs. Miller, Harriet, please, and I'm not suggesting anything improper, just noting that my foreman hasn't smiled this much since before Mr. Miller passed." She patted Grace's flour-covered hand. "Think about it. There's no rush to decide." That afternoon, a thunderstorm rolled in from the mountains. Grace stood at the window, watching lightning fork across the darkening sky when Wade burst through the door, soaked to the skin. "Cattle are spooked," he explained breathlessly to Mrs. Miller. "We're bringing them closer to the barn. Don't worry, we've been through worse." His eyes met Grace's briefly before he disappeared back into the downpour. An hour later, the storm had intensified. Wind howled around the house and rain pounded the roof. Emma was fussy, sensing the tension in the air. "The men should have been back by now," Mrs. Miller said, peering out into the darkness. Just then, the door flew open again. Miguel and Hank stumbled in, dripping water everywhere. "Where's Wade?" Grace asked, her heart suddenly racing. "Lightning spooked his horse," Miguel explained, accepting the towel Mrs. Miller handed him. "He got thrown near the creek, said his ankle might be twisted, but he insisted we bring the cattle in first. I'm going back for him now." "No," Grace said firmly, surprising herself. "You two are exhausted. Tell me where he is, I'll go." "Grace, you can't," Mrs. Miller began. "I'll take the wagon. If his ankle's injured, he'll need to ride back anyway." Grace handed Emma to Mrs. Miller. "Please watch her, I'll be careful." Something in her expression must have convinced them, for Miguel gave her directions to where they'd left Wade. Minutes later, wrapped in an oilskin coat with a lantern swinging from the wagon, Grace drove into the storm. The creek was a quarter-mile from the house, swollen with rainwater and raging in the darkness. Grace held the lantern high, calling Wade's name over the wind and thunder. "Here," came a response, barely audible. She found him sheltering under a large tree, his face pale with pain. "Grace." "What in God's name are you doing out here?" "Being neighborly," she replied, helping him to his feet. "Can you make it to the wagon?" Wade gritted his teeth as he put weight on his injured ankle. "Might need a shoulder to lean on." Together they struggled through the mud to the wagon. By the time Grace helped him onto the seat, they were both soaked despite the oilskin. The return journey was slow and treacherous, but Grace handled the team with surprising skill. "Where did you learn to drive like this?" Wade asked, his voice tight with pain. "My father was a teamster in St. Louis," Grace explained, keeping her eyes on the barely visible track. "He taught me before consumption took him." Back at the ranch, Mrs. Miller clucked over Wade's swollen ankle while Grace changed into dry clothes and checked on Emma, who was sleeping soundly despite the storm. Later, when Wade was settled in a chair with his bandaged ankle propped up, Grace brought him a cup of hot coffee. "Thank you for coming after me," he said quietly. "That was brave," Grace smiled. "You carried us home when we needed it most. I was just returning the favor." Their eyes met, and something unspoken passed between them, recognition, perhaps, of a shared understanding that went beyond gratitude or obligation. The next few weeks brought changes to the Rockingham. Grace accepted Mrs. Miller's offer to stay on permanently. Wade's ankle healed slowly, keeping him close to the house and giving him ample time to entertain Emma, who had taken a particular liking to him. He fashioned toys for her from wood and fabric, and Grace often found him telling the baby elaborate stories about horses and cattle drives when he thought no one was listening. By midsummer, Emma was sitting up on her own and babbling constantly. Grace watched her daughter flourish and felt her own heart healing alongside. The grief for Daniel remained, but it had transformed into something quieter, a sad remembrance rather than a raw wound. One evening, as Grace sat on the porch mending a shirt, Wade joined her with 2 glasses of lemonade. "Thought you might be thirsty," he said, settling into the chair beside her. "Thank you." Grace set aside her sewing to accept the cool drink. "It's a beautiful night." The sky was ablaze with stars, the air fragrant with summer blossoms. From inside came the soft sounds of Mrs. Miller singing to Emma before bed. "I've been meaning to ask you something," Wade said after a moment. "There's a social in town next Saturday, dancing, food, that sort of thing. Mrs. Miller already said she'd watch Emma if you'd care to go, with me." Grace looked at him in surprise. "Are you asking to court me, Wade Keller?" He met her gaze steadily. "I reckon I am, if you'd consider it. I know it hasn't been long since you lost your husband, and I don't mean any disrespect to his memory. But life out here is uncertain, Grace. When you find someone who makes your days brighter, seems foolish not to let them know." Grace's heart raced. "I'm a widow with a child." "Emma's a blessing, not a burden," Wade said simply. "And you're the strongest woman I've ever met. I admire you, Grace, more than I can say." Grace thought of Daniel, his gentle smile, his dreams for their future. He would have wanted her and Emma to be happy, to be cared for. "I would like to go to the social with you," she said softly. Wade's smile lit up his face. I'll borrow Mrs. Miller's buggy, make it proper. The town of Riverdale was small but growing, with a general store, saloon, church, and newly built community hall where the social was held. Grace wore her best dress, a blue cotton that Mrs. Miller had helped alter to fit her slimmer frame, and felt a nervous flutter as Wade handed her down from the buggy. "You look beautiful," he said, offering his arm. Inside, lanterns cast a warm glow over tables laden with food and a cleared space for dancing. Grace knew no one, but Wade introduced her around proudly. The women welcomed her with friendly curiosity, and several men nodded respectfully to Wade, clearly approving his choice of companion. When the fiddles struck up a lively tune, Wade led Grace onto the dance floor. "I should warn you," he said with a grin, "I'm not much of a dancer." "That makes two of us," Grace laughed. They moved somewhat clumsily at first, but soon found their rhythm together. Wade's hand was warm at her waist, his steps becoming more confident as they circled the floor. Grace felt a happiness she hadn't experienced in months, perhaps years, bubbling up inside her. As the evening progressed, they stepped outside for some air. The night was cool, and Wade draped his jacket around Grace's shoulders. "Are you having a good time?" he asked. "The best," Grace admitted. "I'd forgotten what it feels like to just be carefree for a moment." Wade tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, his touch gentle. "You deserve every happiness, Grace Finley." Their first kiss was soft and brief, a question more than a declaration. When Grace didn't pull away, Wade drew her closer, his arms encircling her waist. The second kiss answered that question definitively. The courtship that followed was both traditional and unique to their circumstances. Wade brought Grace wildflowers and took her on Sunday drives, but their most precious moments were often the simplest ones, watching Emma attempt to crawl across the porch, sharing coffee at dawn before the day's work began, talking late into the evening after Mrs. Miller had gone to bed. Grace learned that Wade had grown up in Kansas, the son of a blacksmith. He'd come west at 18, working cattle drives until Mr. Miller had offered him a permanent position. He had no family left living, which perhaps explained his easy attachment to Emma, who now squealed with delight whenever he entered a room. "She loves you," Grace observed one day as Wade tossed the giggling baby gently in the air. "Feelings mutual," Wade replied, settling Emma on his hip. He hesitated before adding, "Grace, there's something I need to discuss with you." His serious tone made her heart skip. "What is it?" "Mrs. Miller's been talking about moving to Helena to live with her daughter. Her rheumatism is getting worse and the winters here are hard on her." "Oh." Grace felt a pang of dismay. "What will happen to the ranch?" "That's what I wanted to talk about." Wade set Emma down on a blanket with her wooden toys. "Mrs. Miller has offered to sell it to me. She'd finance most of it. I've saved some over the years, but not nearly enough otherwise." Hope sparked in Grace's chest. "That's wonderful, Wade. You'd make an excellent rancher on your own account." "Not on my own," Wade said quietly. He took her hands in his. "I'm asking if you'll marry me, Grace. If you'd want to build a life here, raise Emma and maybe more children someday as a family, together." Grace's eyes filled with tears. "Wade, you don't have to answer right away," he hurried to add. "I know it's been less than 6 months since we met, and I don't want to rush you if you're not ready." Grace squeezed his hands. "Yes," Wade blinked. "Yes, yes, I'll marry you." Grace's smile was radiant through her tears. "I love you, Wade Keller. You found us when we were lost, carried us home when we couldn't walk another step, and showed me that life can begin again even after terrible loss. There's no one I'd rather build a future with." They were married in October when the aspen trees turned gold and the first hint of winter touched the air. The ceremony was small, just Mrs. Miller, Hank, Miguel, the minister, and a few neighbors. Emma, now 9 months old and recently taking her first wobbly steps, was passed around and fussed over by everyone. Mrs. Miller moved to Helena the following month, but not before transferring the ranch deed to Wade and Grace. "You two will make this place thrive," she told them. "I couldn't ask for better successors." That first winter as a family was both challenging and joyful. Blizzards sometimes kept them housebound for days, but they filled the time with stories, music from Wade's harmonica, and watching Emma discover new skills almost daily. At night, in the warmth of their bed, Grace and Wade planned for the ranch's future: more cattle in the spring, perhaps horses eventually, improvements to the house as their family grew. When spring finally arrived, bringing with it calving season and endless work, Grace discovered she was expecting their first child together. "Emma will have a little brother or sister by Christmas," she told Wade one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains pink and gold. Wade's face lit with wonder as he placed a gentle hand on her still flat stomach. "Are you happy about it?" "Deliriously," Grace assured him, covering his hand with hers. "Are you?" "More than I can say." He kissed her softly. "When I found you on that trail last year, I never imagined how completely you would change my life." "God works in mysterious ways," Grace murmured. "What seemed like the worst day of my life led me to the best ones." 5 years later, the rocking M was thriving. The small herd had tripled in size, and the ranch house had expanded to accommodate the growing family. Emma, now 5 and full of questions about everything. William, 4 and already determined to be a cowboy like his father, and baby Harriet, named for Mrs. Miller, who had passed peacefully the previous winter. On the anniversary of the day Wade had found Grace and Emma on the trail, the family always had a special dinner. This year, as they sat around the table, 6-year-old Emma asked the question she did every year. "Tell the story again, Papa." "About how you found Mama and me." Wade exchanged a smile with Grace. "Well, I was riding back from delivering a message in Fort Benton, taking a shortcut across the plains when I heard the most beautiful sound." "A baby crying," Emma interrupted excitedly. "That's right," Wade continued. "And when I rode up over that hill, I saw the 2 most precious people God ever put on this earth, all alone under a cottonwood tree." "And you carried us home," Emma finished with satisfaction. "He certainly did," Grace said softly, reaching across the table to take her husband's hand. "And we've been home ever since." Later that night, with the children asleep and the house quiet, Grace and Wade stood on the porch under a canopy of stars. His arm around her waist, her head on his shoulder, they surveyed the land that had become their legacy. "Any regrets?" Wade asked, as he sometimes did. Grace turned in his arms to face him. At 31, she was no longer the desperate young widow he'd found on the verge of collapse. Life had filled out her frame and added a few lines around her eyes, but Wade looked at her with the same devotion as always. "Not a single one," she answered truthfully. "Every mile of that hard journey led me exactly where I was meant to be." Wade kissed her then, under the vast Montana sky, the same sky that had witnessed their beginning and now blessed their future, stretching endlessly with possibility above the home they had built together.